I wanted people to understand the science behind psychic ability, including what's happening with their child, the science behind a ghost, or mental telepathy, or remote viewing. And I do talk a lot about remote viewing, or what's predecessor energy, and why should you care about that? No psychic sees everything. And any psychic who tells you they do, run in the opposite direction. Your future is yours to create. I might be your cheering section for you, but I do not want to impact your future in any conceivable negative way. I can kind of feel the pushback that's going to come from this. Tarot cards are a form of gray or black magic. And again, I've got case study after case study involving cards.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Shifting Dimensions podcast. I'm your host, Jummie Moses, and thank you again for tuning in. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Tina Erwin. You guys might be familiar with her already. I recently interviewed her on the show where we talked about ghosts, helping ghosts, and just some of the paranormal activity that we face in our day-to-day lives. And now I have Tina back on the show again. Just a refresher, Tina is the author of 9 books on metaphysics. She's studied metaphysics all her life and has gained insight into the mystical world of magic and spirituality. Her writing comes from an intense desire to know and understand the hard science behind the unseen world of action and reaction. And today we're diving deep into Tina's new book called Psychic Children, Psychic People. We're going to discuss psychic phenomena, how parents can recognize psychic gifts in their children, protection from unseen forces, and what it means to be psychic. Tina, welcome back to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you back here with us.
Jimmy, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on the show. We're such
Y-
a good team.
yes, we are a great team. And I really recommend and really encourage all of you to go back and watch the first episode with Tina if you haven't already. It was a great episode, and the audience took to it very well. And like I said before, we dove deep into ghosts and paranormal activity. And a lot of the questions that were coming up were just kind of like, how do we protect ourselves from ghosts or entities that are looking to wish us harm? So I'm excited to kind of dig deep into all of that. But first, I really want to start with your book, right? And I want to know why you decided to write the book, Psychic Children, Psychic People. Why is it important at this time?
Well, thank you. And I just happen to have a copy hot off the press, and it's in 3 formats: print on demand, Kindle, and audiobook, 16 hours of audio. The reason I wrote this book, and it was sort of a book 10 years in the making. In addition, I wrote a lot of other books. This is one of these things that's always percolating in the back of my head. And so many parents would come and say, "Oh my gosh, my kid can do these things. What do I do next?" Or, "We haven't had a night's sleep in 2 years." Or, how is this possible? I can't wrap my brain around it. My husband and I fight all the time. Or, I go into my son's bedroom at night and the room is freezing. All the other rooms are nice and warm. The heater's on. The room is freezing. There's no explanation. We're losing our mind. Or, the church says my child is possessed by the devil. Where that the desperation that I heard from so many parents pushed me to write this book and to make it in depth. I mean, I wanted to have this book out 2 years ago, but I couldn't get there from here and have it be a conscientious book. I guess that's the best word. I wanted to be able to answer the myriad of questions that I get. And I had a case last summer with a woman's 10-year-old daughter had telekinetic abilities. This is so rare. She's throwing objects across the room with her mind in her classroom. And the mother is constantly being called in. I mean, over and over and over. And the family thinks they're going to lose their mind and they're terrified. That's why I wrote this book, for people like her. She's a single mom doing the best she can. And I I worked with her for several months, and looked at, and her story is actually in this book, some of the things that were happening with her daughter. Very bright child, and she knew how to throw energy. And so, for that reason and a million more, I wanted people to understand the science behind psychic ability, including what's happening with their child, the science behind a ghost, or mental telepathy, or remote viewing. And I do talk a lot about remote viewing, or what's predecessor energy, and why should you care about that? So that's why I wrote the book, because I always want to help people, and there's a lot of ways to do it, but sometimes knowledge is a lot of power. And you can push back against things that you couldn't even imagine would exist if you have a little knowledge and some pluck and daring.
You know, what I love about knowledge, and I love that you highlighted that, is that knowledge takes away fear of the unknown or what people aren't used to perceiving in their day-to-day life. Like you just talked about telekinesis, and my mind is kind of blown a little bit because obviously I know what telekinesis is by watching a lot of like movies, right? Superhero movies and stuff like that. But I didn't know that was a real psychic phenomenon. Like people could harness such power. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I'm very curious about that. What is it, and how how is it even possible that we're able to do that as human beings?
Well, there's a line in the book where I explain that the ability to, move a pen through the air that floats through the air and you can see and there's nothing with it is a function of addressing and activating subatomic particles. But a 10-year-old doesn't know anything about activating subatomic particles to make them move through the air. And every single case of telekinesis that I have encountered, every one involved an angry teenager, a divorce, and a single mom and a dad that had, a girlfriend. Every single case. And years ago, I met this very wise Jewish woman. And she said in Jewish history, which wouldn't have no way of knowing, in Jewish history, it was not unusual for telekinetic properties to start to manifest with teenagers. And to me, 10 years old was pretty young. They're barely double digit midgets at that age. And so when that begins to happen, the energy of rage has enormous power. When you start to manifest and design in your mind how to get attention, and in the case with the 10-year-old little girl, she wanted her mom's focused attention, and she wanted her grandmother's attention and her brother's attention, and she was making stuff happen like you can't believe. And we resolved it, but the mother had to really step up. This was not a ghost. This was actually not a thought form in this case. This was this little girl throwing her energy and using an object as a dart, a physical, manifesting object. And the more terrified her family members and her school teacher became, the more power she had. And the mother was a crying puddle because she was just terrified. And you're probably going to ask me, gee, how did you resolve that? Well, I did an experiment with the mother because to prove to the mother that the daughter was doing this because they thought there was some entity or their house was possessed or her daughter was possessed. So I cleared the house and I cleared the daughter and I cleared the grandmother's house. I had permission from each person. There's nothing there. They're very nice homes. They're very nice people. They're ordinary people like the rest of us is trying to live their life. And when I was working with the little girl, what I realized was she's so angry her parents divorced. So angry. and she wanted to get as much attention as she could. So she would throw these things, terrify her grandmother, which forced her mother to come home. She's leaving her job 3 and 4 times a day. You can't live like that. And what we did was an experiment where, and I'm devising this on the spot. I'm sort of listening to my own helpers on the other side. And we talked about hugging her and calming her down and breathing. I got her to focus on her breathing and calming, and then everything completely stopped. And the mother said, I don't know what you did. And I said, but I didn't do anything. I'm not going to claim I did some magic thing. That's a lie. All we did was we calmed the energy inside your child. And once we calm the energy inside your child, everything stopped. As soon as the attention moved away from her, it started again. And so she said, she's just sobbing. She said, I don't know what to do. I said, you're going to put your big girl panties on and you're going to have a come to Jesus moment with your child and tell her she is to stop this right now. You're not putting up with it. And her grandmother's not going to put up with it anymore. We know she's doing it. There's no ghost, there's no entity. She has to stop, and she has to stop right now because you're not putting up with it. And if you continue to do this, all these things are going to start being removed from you because you have control of this, and I'm not putting up with it. And I'm not leaving work anymore. I'm not going to allow you to cause me to lose my job. And it never happened again because I wanted the mom to be a parent, not a puddle of fear, but a strong projecting parent, which immediately made her daughter feel safe. Her daughter, in the end, got what she wanted. She wanted a parent, not a fearful mom. This mom is a very good woman. I give her really high marks. She was faced with an untenable situation. She was referred to me by Charity Dawson. Charity Dawson wrote the foreword in this book in part 2. And that's how we made the connection. And it took us a couple weeks because it's a process of elimination. But in this case, this was really a psychological, emotional issue. It was not, it looked like a paranormal issue, but it wasn't. And that's how we resolved it.
Very, 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 very fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I know that a lot of children are born with psychic abilities, and most of them are not as obvious as the girl you just described with telekinesis abilities. So I do want to talk about that, but I kind of want to level set a little bit more, right? So we're going to go back to that question to dig a little bit further. But I want to talk about what is the definition of a psychic? What does it mean to be psychic? Because we hear those words all the time. Are we all psychic? Or are there some people who are more tapped in than others and the rest of us are just like generally intuitive?
I bet you love music, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Are you a professional musician?
No.
Okay. Well, we're all psychic, and some of us are just a little bit more psychic than others. I play 7 different instruments, none of them well. I just thought it was cool to see what they were all like, but I'm not ever going to be a musician. So, but I dearly love music. I can't imagine life without it. It lifts my soul. In the beginning of this book, I explained that we have to have psychic ability to function in life. You can't go through life and not have those psychic moments where the voice in your head warned you to change lanes, where you had a feeling and you looked behind you, or you hesitated at that stoplight and somebody ran it and you saved your own life. And in this book on psychic children and psychic people, there are 70 case studies of people who didn't think they had any psychic ability whatsoever, and oh my gosh, it saved their life, or they couldn't explain it, but they believed themselves. They believed that there was something higher, maybe looking out for them. And when people say, oh, this psychic ability is just psychobabble, I remind them that we all must have this. It reminds us to pay attention to the safety elements. You remember, if you get in your car and you don't put your seatbelt on, something reminds you to do that. I was thinking about two friends of mine recently, and I immediately, 2 days later, I got an email from them saying, oh, we should get together and have a little Christmas lunch, the three of us. Well, there was a psychic connection. These ladies don't necessarily think they're psychic, but we shook hands, we hugged each other. We have a physical connection called Aka cords, which again are explained in this book. So we're communicating. Well, those cords might be, thin like my computer cord, for a friend. For a child, a husband, a parent, that cord is like a fiber optic cable. When something is terribly wrong, you're going to feel it, but you can't necessarily explain it to someone. Those people aren't crazy. What they're feeling is real, and it's so important. So, yes, to answer your question, we are all psychic. Some of us have greater levels of ability, and those have been built up life after life after life. So you get to a point in a lifetime where it's like you get a greater opportunity to use it and to be more professional at it. I mean, when I retired from the Navy, I started a computer company. I had contracts with Apple Computer to start putting computers in every new home in America with my software. That didn't work, because if that had worked, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you. And I had to step back and say, okay, I closed my company, I paid off my investors, and this is really what I'm supposed to be doing. And then everything started to fall in line. But I went to the school of hard knocks because I'm 5'1" now. But when I started, I was 6 feet tall. Let me tell you, I have been hammered because there were things I needed to learn. So that's sort of a beginning explanation. Does that open up more questions for you?
Oh, of course it does. You know me. Okay, so I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying. So you're basically saying we all have some sort of psychic ability, some sort of intuitive ability. It's just that some people are more um tuned in, and that could come from lifetime after lifetime. So some people are just predestined to have very strong psychic abilities because they're supposed to use it in some shape or form in this life, in their current life, right? Or whatever life that they're on. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit more. So, uh, people who have such strong psychic abilities, is there karma attached to that? And can you just briefly explain what karma is for people who are listening who may not understand that question fully?
Karma is a physics principle. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. I didn't create the physics principle, it's always been there. That's karma. And when you do something nice for someone, it comes back to you eventually. And if you do something really terrible, that karma has to come back to you too. Sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it takes lifetimes to come back. You aren't going to know that. If you have developed psychic ability over lifetimes, you earned it. That's why I don't call it a gift. You have earned it life after life. If you're using it in a karmically correct way to help someone else, you're not telling their future, you're not flipping pretty cards. You're actually looking at, how do I best use this ability for the service of another person? And sometimes people go into ministry because they feel a connection to God. And it's a type of psychic ability. I can feel ministers bristling. But a really good psychic has a really strong connection to God, to angels, to the divine. And that's a beautiful thing. Your connection to all that is wonderful grows. And the more you're seeking ways to do service, just like you are with this podcast, you're influencing other people through an act of service by helping to clear up confusion, misunderstanding, helping them conquer fear. All of those are karmic service actions. They carry a reaction. People go, oh my gosh, I feel so much better, or I don't have to be afraid, or I know what the references are. All of those things, that's karma in action. But when you have someone who does something using psychic ability, and I talk about this in this book, where they're telling someone, let's say someone tells a future. I get asked this, I can't tell you how often, what do you see is happening in my future? Can you do a reading? And I'll go, no, I don't. I don't do readings. I'm not going to tell you your future, because then I'm creating a reality. I'm creating a different karmic path. Maybe you're going like this, but now I'm veering you off your path. Oh my gosh, I don't want that karma. So every word that I say, I'm measuring constantly. Someone's listening to this. How is this going to help them relinquish fear and to be stronger, but without violating spiritual law, which I do talk about, or violating spiritual law, karmic law? And there's an example in this book, and this actually comes from a book by Dr. Richard Lawrence from the Aetherius Society. And he is very amazing man. And he tells the story of a psychic in England. He was a palm reader. And this psychic was considered very good. And you would go to him and he would look at your palm and he would read it. And he goes, oh my gosh, I can see that you've been trying something several times. And I can see that the very next time you try this, you're going to be successful. The guy was so thrilled. And so he tried it again and he successfully killed himself. Oh my God. Now, every single person listening to me should say, why didn't the psychic see death on his palm? And you would be right to ask that question. And the answer is, which is why this is so important, is because no psychic sees everything. And any psychic who tells you they do, run in the opposite direction. Your future is yours to create. I might be your cheering section for you, but I do not want to impact your future in any conceivable negative way. That palm reader was so disturbed by what happened, he never read another palm as long as he lived. He was horrified. It was a very powerful lesson. And he learned the lesson. You do not tell futures. You don't read palms. You don't do cards. You don't do readings, because you do not know what those consequences are. I mean, I have other examples of horrific karma created by psychics doing these things.
Wow, wow, wow. Okay. Two things I want to clarify here, right? I think it's important that you're bringing up the whole notion of predicting the future, because I think when people hear the word psychic, it's synonymous for reading the future, right? But I mean, if people have been listening throughout the show, we've been talking about psychic abilities in a general sense, right? Which encompasses a lot of different types of things, which we're going to get deeper into. But I just want to clarify that with you about psychic doesn't necessarily mean being able to tell the future. And then the other part I want to clarify with you is you said that a lot of people who have strong psychic abilities, a lot of times it's supposed to be in service to people. And people use cards, for example, as service to people, reading cards, tarot cards especially. And they genuinely believe that they're doing good work because they've taken time to study, to harness the gifts in that area. So are you saying that people who are choosing to be of service to people by reading tarot cards are not necessarily on the right path, and that could create a lot of karmic debt? So that was a lot there. I hope you got the two things I want you to clarify, but just wanted to touch on both of those.
Well, I'm really glad you did. And again, I can kind of feel the pushback that's going to come from this. Tarot cards are a form of gray or black magic. And again, I've got I've got case study after case study involving cards. Tarot cards are magic. They are a form of gray or black magic. It took me years to understand this. And the reason they are so dangerous is, for instance, I have a deck of playing cards, 52 cards, they're kind of beat up. Well, if those were tarot cards and you're shuffling them over and over and you're holding them, what's the first thing the psychic says is shuffle the deck, cut the cards, because you've now imprinted your energy on those cards and you never erased it. So the psychic depends on a being in the fourth dimension to guide him or her in doing these readings. And there's a Celtic cross method, and there's different methods of reading cards. And it makes you feel powerful because you look at the cards and you can figure these things out. But what tarot card readers do not clearly understand is that you, the reader, will pay a price for the reading. And they're called spellbinders. It's the name I give them. I don't know what else to call them. The spellbinders cause you to believe you're really powerful, that you're reading the cards, that you're getting it from spirit. They're on the other side of the veil, and you're their puppet on a string. And they take payment for this ability or this quote gift you think you have. And I've watched, there's not a lot of wealthy tarot card readers, let me assure you. Because the spellbinders will take their payment whenever they want, and they feed on misery. The spellbinders behind the cards feed on misery, illness, finances, family discord, filth, dirt, ego. It's like it's their food. When you don't use those cards, if you are working with a client and you're a true spiritual practitioner, you don't need those things. If you are truly working on spiritual service, what need of you for cards? You don't need them. Cut them in half, it breaks the magic, and burn them. And they are really hard to burn. They have one amazing coating on them. I have had client after client after client after client, either physically sick, chronically sick. I know someone not far from me, chronically sick. It's like she gets well and then she gets sick, and then she gets well and then she gets sick. And she has, I don't know, 25 different decks. She doesn't use them. She doesn't tell readings. She just thinks they're a beautiful art form. But I have other people whose finances, oh my gosh, they're in the toilet. And they might have 10 decks and they keep them either in their pillow, under their pillow, in their nightstand, by their bed, or in their underwear drawer. So that those cards and the spellbinders are close to the most intimate parts of you. It just, and this is true for runes, any form of divination, runes, and all those angel cards, Ouija boards, any form of tarot cards. And there are some tarot cards that were created by black magicians. And some of the black magicians, I won't even mention the names, they're so evil. They created their own tarot decks. I was at a metaphysical bookstore one time and I thought, why am I here? And this woman walks up to the counter and she has one of these hideously evil decks. And she says to the guy, because she was clueless, she says, "You think this is a good deck?" The guy said, "Yeah, it'll be just fine." And I looked at him and he looked at me and I said, "Ma'am, that deck of cards is going to make your life hell. It is pure. It's one of the most serious levels of black magic if you buy that Black Magician's cards. Put them back if you want your life to be sane, please. And she put the deck down and she ran out of the store. And I knew that's why I was there. That woman didn't have the karma to be tortured by those cards. I was placed there that day. I never went back to the store. But for that moment, I was there for her. I don't know who she was. So sometimes when a student is ready, a teacher will be there, even if it's just momentarily. I was so horrified when I didn't even realize that this horrible, horrible man had created such a deck. When you think satanic ritual, 1,000% worse than that. And if you're buying a deck, you don't have a clue whether it's his or somebody else's. I know many people have heard of Doreen Virtue, and she had all different kinds of tarot decks. And she came out several years ago, and she apparently had some sort of a major moment and realized they were not a good thing. And she now has steered away from those cards, which I was really glad to see. I know many psychics market the cards because they're famous, so they market their cards. I'm not ever going to do that. I've had people say, "Oh, you should do your cards." It's like I'm never going to do that.
Hmm.
I have to practice what I preach. I know what the karma is attached to this. My daughter asked me to go to a yoga studio with her, and this was in La Jolla, California. And at the checkout place at the yoga studio, they had a tarot card deck in a basket. And I said, "What are these doing here?" And she said, "It's so cool. I ask everyone to just shuffle the deck for fun." I was horrified because every single person who went into that yoga studio shuffled that deck. And that black magician in charge of those cards on the other side is going to now feed on every single person who shuffled the deck. It's not just the reader, it's the client who comes in to have their cards read. They are now connected to that black magician. And they may not know why their life went downhill. If somebody wants to work with me as a client, it's the first question I ask. Do you have any tarot cards? Oh, I do. I have 3 or 4 decks, but I don't use them. It's okay. It's not okay. If you're not willing to get rid of the decks, then there's no place for me to go with this because it's just like taking a bath and then going back out and wallowing in the mud. I mean, it's just that bad.
Hmm.
I,
Wow.
I, I'm pretty adamant, but I really am.
Wow. 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 Okay. Okay, this is really good, right? I want to follow up on the spellbinders piece because I really want to make sure I understand. So are the spellbinders the people who are operating the deck, or are the spellbinders the entities influencing the reader? Because you talked about the fact that people are inadvertently relying on a being in the fourth dimension to relay information to them, to give to people who they're reading to. So is that the spellbinder, or is the spellbinder the person who created the cards, who's shuffling the cards, giving the reading?
The tarot card reader as a physical person is the puppet on a string of the entity in the other dimension. And those magicians, they're it's not personal, you're just lunch. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. They have to feed on something and you're handy. And
Okay.
and when the longer you use the cards, the lower your frequency.
Oh, okay. And then because they're using the readers as puppets, right? And they're grieving readings to people. So now they're, like you said, they're influencing how that person who's receiving the reading, how they live their life, what they choose to believe versus not believe. Okay, so I understand what you're saying. I have to ask though, because one of the things that I'm constantly trying to figure out, right, in this world that we live in, a lot of people think in black and white terms, right? And the more I have conversations with people, the more I keep finding myself at this conclusion that is obviously flexible, where it's kind of like, is everything potentially harmful, or it just depends on who's wielding the power or who's using it? So the reason why I'm saying that is because when it comes to tarot decks, for example, I know that there's some practitioners who say that they work with the light. They work with the beings of the light. They are connecting with God, the one true creator. So is every tarot deck reader inherently practicing black magic, or are there some who could potentially be doing good work with it or be connecting with light beings on the other side to help them with this work?
If you're connecting with light beings, you don't need cards. I would challenge every single person. It's not up to me to judge anyone else. I will I will say this. If you're connecting with the light, you do not need the cards. Period. If you believe that, because you have to remember, black magicians can masquerade as angels and light beings and, the great ones. And most, I'm generalizing, most tarot card readers never perform due diligence on the being on the other side. Never. They accept what they're told. They accept that this is a being of the light. How do you know? I mean, really. And I'm going to delve a little bit deeper here. If this reader was sexually abused, this person is very vulnerable to black magic because sexual abuse violates an individual at the core, most intimate level. Why do you think so many women unconsciously store their tarot decks in their underwear drawer? I had one woman with 25 decks in her underwear drawer. I don't know how she had room for underwear. Uh, I was just jaw dropped. And one of the sweetest women I have ever known, kind and generous. I loved her dearly. She had 50 tarot card decks. I talk about this in this book. And she collected them. She assured me they were innocent, that they were art forms. And you don't have to kiss a rattlesnake on the lips to figure out it's just really dangerous. I mean, it might look fine and you think you're protected by that glass. But the rattlesnake on the other side of the glass is always creating a level of fear in you. You're just not conscious of it. And when you're using tarot card decks and you believe you're connecting to the light, and or if you suffered any sexual abuse, may not be connecting to who you think you are. I'm not here to judge anyone, but is it black and white? I'll be honest, for me it is.
Hmm.
For me it is.
Okay.
If someone's using that, I know that there's a manipulator behind the scenes. And if that soul chooses that experience, it's not up to me to say, oh, shame on you, you shouldn't have that experience. All I'm going to say is, my ability to help you will be severely limited. You must choose. Because on everybody's spiritual path, you have a fork in the road. Are you going to seek the light without a crutch? Are you going to stand tall and walk toward that light with a conviction that lives within you without the crutches?
So, for psychic and spiritual practitioners listening to this right now who use a lot of divination tools to help others and maybe help themselves as well, you talked about not a lot of people not doing due diligence with the entities that they're working with. So, how can someone tell that they're working with a nefarious entity that's posing to be in the light, but they're actually not in the light? Are there telltale signs that people can pick up on?
They're subtle. The signs are the signs that they're not really who you think they are very, very subtle. These magicians in the fourth dimension are really, really clever. They've had eons to practice. And one of the surest ways is to let's just say somebody said, well, I believe that the beings that I work with are of the light. Okay, can you prove it? No, I just know, I just trust spirit. Who is spirit? I just trust spirit. Um, well, that's really vague. How do you know? So one of the ways that I use a lot of ways, which I don't always publicize, but I use a lot of ways because like any psychic, I'm hearing things from the other side. I'm not using cards, but I'm hearing things. Is it logical? Does it make sense? Does it follow spiritual law? Does it follow karmic law? You're doing this and you had to ask all those questions. Somebody wants you to tell a future, and the beings of light tell you you can do this, or an angel told you you can tell this person this future. Newsflash, angels can't do that. Angels can't violate spiritual law. No divine being from the fifth dimension can violate spiritual law. I'm here to tell you they cannot. Um, and if they do, they're not who you think they are. Fill the room you're in with salt. Visualize that this massive rain of pure sodium chloride, salt, back to science, is falling and falling and falling in the room you're in. That you're filled up with it, that you're covering yourself with it. And then see how easy it is to hear them. Because it acts like acid on a dark being. If it's truly a light being, it will have no effect whatsoever.
Mm.
I've used much stronger things. And even after all this time, I perform due diligence on the team that I work with every single time. At this point, I cannot afford to be fooled. And these beings are clever. The higher you raise your frequency, the less often you will find an imposter. But you have to check every single time. You put your seatbelt on every single time you get in the car. You don't trust spirit to keep you safe. You don't. You have to trust yourself. So I'm challenging every tarot card reader who's listening to this. Cut your cards in half and burn them, and then see what your life is like.
Hmm. It's so interesting that you're saying everything that you're saying because, one of the things I noticed is that a lot of people who are super religious go into the more new age practices, which involves a lot of tarot card readings, etc. And I'm sure I'm overgeneralizing here, but there's a huge chunk of them who end up running back to the church because they talk about encountering um, negative entities that they weren't even aware that they were dealing with the whole time. So it kind of sounds like that's what you're talking about as well. But I want to kind of zero in on the future thing, right? So I know that sometimes, for example, there's this knowing that I always have. So every time someone close to me is pregnant, I have a dream and I know the exact gender of the child before the child is born, before the parents know the gender of the child. Now, someone could say, I don't go around being like, "Hey, you're gonna have a boy, you're gonna have a girl." I'm just like, "Oh, I saw that," right? When the child comes. Now, someone could say that's a form of seeing the future, right? And there are some psychics who, I guess maybe they're guessing, right? But there are people. I would use a remote viewer, for example, that I recently just interviewed, which I think remote viewing is a psychic phenomenon, where she talked about seeing the 9/11 twin tower attacks a few years before it happened, right? And she, spoke about it. I don't think she was necessarily saying, "Oh, this is going to happen," but she had seen the vision or she had seen it in her remote viewing
A lot of
session.
people saw that. I did
Yes.
not, but a lot
Okay.
of people did see it.
Right.
She's not. That's not unknown, and so that makes a lot of sense.
Right. Right. So again, speaking about the future piece of, being a psychic, and I know you said that, it's not predicting the future is not necessarily psychic work, but there's a lot of evidence that psychics do predict the future often. So can you just kind of talk about that and how that's different from and how if those type of visions that come true, do they still kind of accrue karmic debts or have any sort of negative karmic effects? If
That
that
is
makes
a
any sense.
that is that is a really, really, really good question. And I have pondered this. I actually talk about this in this book. I pondered this for years because I've seen things and they came true. And I was so innocent about knowing that, you're seeing something. What do you do with it? Some of the things I saw were wonderful, and some of them were horrific. Some things I could stop, and some things there was nothing I could do about it. Like the woman who saw the 9/11. Well, so many people saw it. It was in The Simpsons. We know that. There was a movie about to be made about the entire 9/11 attacks. And I know this because my brother worked in Hollywood and he was a contract negotiator for Screen Actors Guild. And he talked about they had a film that was, they were about to start filming, and everything that happened on 9/11 was in the script, which means there's several theories here. And I'm going to say that they're theories. This doesn't mean I'm right. It's just a theory. So I'm offering it for people to consider that we have to go back to Einstein and time. Does time move in an sorry a minute, in a straight line? Or does time move in eddies and pools? Is time what we think it is? Are we living today, but the future's already happened? Maybe. So Jean Dixon is one of a very famous psychic in the 60s. I studied a little bit about Jean Dixon. Excuse me. She went to John Kennedy and said, Mr. President, if you go to Dallas, they are going to kill you. I have seen it over and over. Please don't go. Please don't go. Please don't go. The country needs you. Please don't go. Okay, you're the president of the United States. You're going to listen to a psychic? It's the 60s. And the rest is history. Abraham Lincoln predicted his own death. Princess Diana predicted her own death and the method of death. So is the future known? I think that there are parts of us, this again, my theory, parts of us can tap into what I call the mind belt. And it doesn't mean you're a super psychic or you're a remote viewer. It just means that you tapped in. Lincoln would never have said he was psychic, but he knew his death was coming. He could feel it. And I believe that because time has a fluidity, we don't fully appreciate. It's like smoke swirls and moves up. It isn't just necessarily a straight line all the time, sometimes, but not all the time. And that maybe some things in time are existing because of how a direction has to go. Can some things be stopped? Can you imagine that she wished she could have stopped 9/11? Who would she tell? Who would believe her? In fact, there were many people who talked to the FBI and said, I can see this is how this, these guys only want to know how to fly a plane. They don't want to know how to land it. They don't want to know how to take off or land. I saw their interview. They only want to know how to fly the plane. They went to the FBI with the names of the terrorists on 9/11. The FBI said, I will look into it. And it was a flight school in Virginia. Those guys had a bad feeling something was going to happen. And so what they did was they they tried to do something about it, which is why afterwards they were livid because they warned the FBI. The FBI didn't listen. Was it already part of a bigger elaborate plan that none of us fully understand? And maybe since I understand that the 9/11 investigation is about to be made public in the coming months, maybe we will all understand more. So sometimes you can have a feeling that something's coming. I have a story about a lieutenant who worked for me. It's a very, very interesting story because it involved me. And he was a Texan. He had this white blonde hair and his giant blue eyes. And He had a lot of issues. He was a good man. And I had this incredibly difficult job trying to protect, $100 billion in submarine assets. And I wanted him to continue working for me, but he didn't screen for executive officer on a nuclear submarine. So that meant that he was going to go to a diesel boat. And he worked for me for a while, and then he said, Commander, I have orders to the submarine in Japan and out of Yokosuka, and I have a horrible feeling. Please get my orders changed. I said, that is really hard. That's a tall task. I only have so many silver bullets. And I worked for weeks to get his order changed because every day he said, you have to understand, this feeling is horrific. Something horrible is going to happen. It's just, I got to tell you, it's a horrible, horrible feeling. Something horrible is going to happen. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I I used every trick in the book. I talked to his detailer who tells you where you're going to go. I could not get his orders changed. And so he went to this old diesel submarine in Japan. And one night, it's a flat, calm, moonless black night. And it's a glass sea. I mean, there's not a ripple, there's not a wave. So the submarine is snorkeling, they're on the surface, and a submarine on the surface sort of bobs, a little bit. And he's up there with two topside watches. You have the officer of the deck, who is my lieutenant, and two other men. And it's such a glass calm night. There's not a wind, there's not a breeze. It's flat calm. Nobody clicked themselves into the submarine. They were just, usually you have a harness, a safety thing. They didn't do that. So that when the rogue wave hit the submarine out of nowhere, this wall of water drove this submarine straight down with a hatch open. The salt water pouring into the submarine started fires everywhere inside the ship. Eventually, the water put the fire out. They managed to get the hatch closed with three men topside. And Dixie told me that it hits you so fast, you can't wrap your brain around it. And he guessed he let go at the 40-foot level. And he didn't think he would ever reach the surface. This water column just seemed to have no end. And his eardrums burst, and the vessels in his eyes burst, and he's in a dark navy blue, what they call poopy suit, which is what they wear on submarines. So he's in a wine dark sea wearing black clothes, basically, dark, dark clothes, and there's no moon. And he never sees the submarine again. And he never saw the other two crew members. And so his premonition, something terrible was going to happen, all of a sudden, he is living it. So as time goes on, finally, he's bobbing in the sea. As time goes on, he is, praying that the submarine got a message off to naval activities in Yokosuka, Japan. They did. They put the fire out. They pumped the water overboard. They trimmed the ship, meaning instead of doing this, they brought the ship up to a level point. They trimmed the ship. And they sent a message to Naval Activities Japan that they had three men overboard. The three worst things that can happen are fire, flooding, and man overboard. They had all three of them in moments. And so dawn comes, and the first propeller-driven plane comes overhead. And you know that a propeller-driven plane is loud. The pilots have earmuffs, they have super earmuffs on, and they're squawking, and there's the engines, and they are going over the search area where the last fix was for where the ship was. And I mean, it's just Pacific Ocean as far as you can imagine. And Dixie hears that plane come. He hears it. And they fly right over him and they can't see him. He's screaming and screaming, and they can't hear him. They got things on their ears, right? And they leave. Can you imagine what it would be like to be in the Pacific Ocean, just your little blonde hair and your big blue eyes, and that is all anybody can see. And they can't see him. About 4 hours later, they come back. And they still don't see him. And he knows he might get one more shot and they won't ever come back again. They're going to just chalk it up to died at sea. And so he starts to talk to God. And he says, God, if you save me, I will devote my life to you. If you save me, I I'm having a spiritual moment here, words to that effect. And so finally, as the day is leaving, that plane comes by one more time. And he does something. I've only heard one other person talk about that. He sends out a psychic scream because he knows they're not going to hear his voice. He sends out a telepathic scream of desperation, of beyond desperation. And the pilots heard him. They don't know how they heard him, but they heard him. And they started circling him and tipping their wings at him. And then they rescued him. He was rescued. Now, you must be wondering what happened to the other two men. Both of those men did the same thing Dixie did. They told their families that if they went to that ship, something terrible was going to happen. Only they told their families they were going to die there and they would never come home. And that when they said goodbye, they were going to die on that ship. But they didn't know how. This is the thing about a premonition. You get this little tiny piece of the puzzle, and this is the whole puzzle, this huge, but you get this piece. So a psychic who says, I see this, they get this little tiny piece of this massive puzzle. So Dixie knew something bad was going to happen, but he didn't know it was a rogue wave on a glass calm sea. Those two men knew something was bad was going to happen. They didn't know there was a rogue wave. They didn't know what was going to happen. We don't know if anyone else on board had premonitions that something was going to happen. This told me that men have premonitions all the time. They just don't necessarily talk about it. And we found this out because their families came forward and somehow I ended up with this information. And he was rescued. In the meantime, I'm going back because I'm at, Commander Submarine Force Atlantic Fleet headquarters, and his wife is in Norfolk. So I rushed to her house to tell her what was happening when we found out he was rescued, so that the news media would not overwhelm this woman. She didn't deserve that. She had no idea, but she knew. She was really, really, really worried about him. And he came back. He left the ship. He never went back to the ship. And he got out of the Navy and he became a minister. He kept his word and he believes that he was saved. And we don't know why the other two men were not. We don't know whether they died or whether they, as an afterthought, did click themselves in. Dixie said he absolutely didn't, but he couldn't remember if the other two men did. If they did, the force of that wave shoving them to the bottom, they might have hit the side of the sail of the submarine. They might have drowned immediately. We simply don't know. Their bodies were never recovered. And so in this story, 3 people had a premonition with the only element fear. Something's going to happen. Not what day, not what time, not what the event is, who's going to live, but 2 out of the 3 knew they were going to die. And this is the kind of thing that I think about. How could this be? And he lived and he's doing these things to be of service to others, but he believes in psychic ability. And he and I had some long conversations when he came back.
You know,
So
the
I'm not
question,
sure if I've answered your question, but it's a question that you discussed. You don't necessarily have a pat answer.
of course, of course. And, you know, the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm sure the listeners are thinking about this as well, is if they had the premonition, right? And they had the power in this instance to not go on the ship, to not go on that mission, why choose to go? I don't think you would have that answer, right? You're not them. But that's something that, you know, is in my mind as like, why would they choose to go if they could feel the fear? I mean, some could argue maybe they don't want to lose their livelihood. And I think a lot of times people gaslight themselves when they have certain knowings, feelings, or, you know, intuitive insights. But it's interesting that they had that premonition, especially the two men that ended up passing away, and they still decided to go on that trip and take that mission.
Well, they had to obey the orders. They
Hmm.
couldn't get out fast enough because they would still, even if they had said, "I'm getting out," I don't want to execute the orders. They were going to say, "We got these bullets to fill." They would have had a really hard time getting out of that. It would have been really, really, really hard.
Mm.
I have other situations where people did take action. I have another story if you're okay with another story.
Yes.
Um, my husband and I were first married, and we were living in bachelor officer quarters in Connecticut, in New London, Connecticut. And there was a fast attack submarine that was operating in Autac, which is a range off that runs parallel to the east coast of the United States. And they do a lot of training in this, and it's a deep V shaped, and it runs for like 1,000 miles. It's incredible. So, it's fast attack submarine thinks, you know, that they're going through the V. They do, so they're going, along the V, but they're actually doing this, ready to plow into the side of the wall, the seawall. Somehow their navigation, it's not like there's windows, somehow their navigation was wrong. So I, we're in the BOQ, and we're all talking, and we find out that this happened. So here's the story. This ship, I will leave it, I'm not going to mention the name of the ship, had a lieutenant on watch, and another lieutenant's about to relieve him. The relieving lieutenant wakes up 15 minutes early with a horrendous premonition that something horrible is about to happen. It's so bad, he is consumed with this premonition. So he rushes to control and says, I have the watch, I relieve you. And the guy says, "Oh, go back to bed. You got another 15 minutes. Go back to your rack." And he says, "No, I relieve you." And the guy says, "Dude, all right, I stand relieved." As soon as he says, "I relieve you," he turns to the helm and he says, "Right full rudder, all back full now." So that when the submarine hit the mountain, it was a glancing blow. All back full, they still had the momentum in the water. Right full rudder meant that when they hit the mountain, it was a glancing blow. And I saw the ship in the shipyard, and it looked like someone had taken aluminum foil. If you have a piece of aluminum foil and you punch it, that's what the bow, the nose of that submarine looked like. I'll never forget that. And the whole ship is rocked with this impact. And they immediately surface the ship and assess the damage, talk to Norfolk, which is where submarine force headquarters were, limped back into port. This man's premonition saved 125 men. And I really wanted your listeners to hear this story. This man never thought of, and I talked to him when he came back to the BOQ. He didn't consider himself psychic. And, of course, he was court martialed because that's the Navy. And he was exonerated. Karmically, he saved 125 lives because he had permission, because he had a premonition. But he didn't have the captain's permission, the navigator's permission, the XO's permission to change course. He didn't have anybody's permission. He just did it. He was driven to say, right full rudder, all back full. So he was exonerated. The captain and the navigator and the XO were relieved for cause, destroyed their careers, but they're still alive.
Wow.
I mean, and I'm sharing stories about men. People think it's women. I have so many stories about stuff that happened with men. It's amazing. That gut feeling saved 125 lives. Did he have a feeling before the ship got underway? I don't know. I didn't ever have that part of the conversation with him. All I know is that when I finally got to speak to him and it was over, he was still in shock that this happened. He says, I'm not a psychic guy. I'm not a psychic guy. And he kind of wandered away. What happened to me? Dude, you're the hero.
Yeah, and I think sometimes things come to us because we're supposed to take action of some sort. Um, and I think as we've been kind of having this discussion, it just kind of made me think a lot of people say that, the future is kind of like a moving target, right? So sometimes, going back to your point about people just kind of offering the future to people, right? And how that doing that sometimes is dangerous because the future is a moving target, and then you impress upon someone a certain path that they're supposed to take that might not necessarily be aligned for them. But then there are other situations where the future is given to us without us necessarily seeking it out in the forms of premonition so we can do something about it or maybe potentially come to terms with it. Again, that's just a small analysis of everything we've just been talking about. And I know it's going to be an ongoing discussion in general throughout the podcast.
Exactly. And that's a very good analysis. I mean, that's an excellent analysis because there's not just one kind of premonition. There's premonition you can actually do something about, things you can't do something about, things you can't explain, and things that you stand in pure horror when you see that there was nothing you could do to stop what was going to happen.
Absolutely. Well, now I kind of want to follow up with a question that I had at the beginning, but wanted to kind of ask other questions in between. And that is for parents who have psychic children whose psychic abilities are not exactly as loud as the child who had the telekinesis abilities, how can they tell that their child has psychic abilities? And what can they do to help foster those abilities and also protect their child, depending on what their child is coming in contact with?
I think the first thing is if your child does something that unnerves you, says something. I've had sometimes, a grandchild will say something to me, and it's like, so by God, I wrote that down in case something else comes up. So my first suggestion is get a logbook, not just any, three-ring binder, but a beautiful book like you buy at, Barnes and Noble or something, and that's bound, and start writing down the experiences, the date, the time, how did it happen? If your child is talking to someone and there's no one there, which happened to my granddaughter, they came home from the commissary and her 18-month-old is chattering to thin air. And so my daughter asked me to remote view the house, and I found this mother and daughter who died in the parking lot of the commissary. And they'd gone home with all kinds of people. They eventually go back to the commissary parking lot. But they came home with my granddaughter, it was many years ago, and I crossed her over. And so you write those things down, or your child starts to react to something you can't see. So instead of dismissing what your child is saying, oh, you're just a kid, you don't know, pay attention. The parents who pay attention have fewer problems with their children. And, or the child says, I don't trust that person, or they're terrified of that person. Write it down. Start not reacting, but acknowledging, well, tell me about it on this day. And what does that mean? Or tell me what, don't give them the third degree and don't be afraid. Just matter of fact, have a conversation. Children know if you're being real or if you're being fake. Don't be fake, be real. And just write it down. And when you start writing it down, maybe it's separated by months. Maybe it only happens one time. But if you start seeing a beginning pattern, then get the Psychic Children book. Because, I start putting it out. If your child has nightmares, one of my other granddaughters was afraid to sleep in her room. I mean, I cleared the room. I don't know, there's nothing wrong with it. So we put a green light bulb under her bed. She never complained again. I knew that the frequency of green would stop anything that might be attracted to the sweetness of her nature. So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of tools in this book, including explaining what green light bulbs are and why they work. Your child is afraid at night. As long as you keep a record and then you start studying the tools and you start implementing the tools and then record what happens. Now you have cause and effect, action and reaction. You use a tool, now you have cause and effect, action and reaction. Basically, you're using a type of scientific method with it, especially if you have doubting Thomas as your husband and you want to be, logical about it and not fearful. Again, all of the work that, you and I are doing is, and with your other guests, is designed to remove fear. Just remove the fear. Let's be matter of fact. Let's grow with the situation. Could be really interesting. And this is true for teenagers. Sometimes psychic ability develops when you're a teenager. Another fascinating psychic ability is psychometry, where you feel, I feel that so and so used this pen, and they're 6 foot tall and they have gray hair, and that's psychometry. You can tell all about it because of the auric residue that's left on the object. And one of my kids is a mechanic, and he was in mechanic school. He's a wonderful mechanic. We're really, really, really proud of him. And he he was watching another guy work on a car, and he could hear the car say, God, I hate this guy. I hate this guy. He's not putting the wheels on right, and it's all going to fall off. He's not even going to get a mile from here, and all the wheels are going to fall off. He's an idiot. And my son couldn't believe he heard that. It was so bizarre. So he goes to the guy and he says, hey, do you want me to double check that your wheels are on really tight? And the guy said, no, I don't need that. I took care of it. Leave me alone. He didn't get down the block and all four wheels fell off. Completely unnerved my son. Completely unnerved him. And so he could do it now and then. It's not something he wanted to pursue. But it was fascinating to me. He said, why did I hear that? And I said, well, you know, uh, this is a different show, but certain alien spacecraft are alive. They have, and I got this from a fascinating scientist by the name of David Adair. And when you touch the metal, there is an energy from you and an exchange with the metal and the spacecraft. And it's run entirely on the relationship between the pilot and the metal in the plane, in the spacecraft. And when you're, when you're talking about this, what you're looking at is metal has a frequency. The metal can have a high frequency or a low frequency, and you can determine that. So if your frequency is low and you get in your car and you say, I hate this piece of you know what, you lower the frequency of the metal in your car, sometimes to a dangerous place. But if you get in the car and you say, oh my gosh, I just love my car, I just dearly love my car, you've raised the frequency of the metal. I've seen cars that should have fallen apart on the road, but the car loved the person. That happened to me. I'm in Italy. I pull into the Italian gas station and so I spoke a lot of Italian, many years ago. And I was being expansive, so I asked the mechanic if he would please check the oil in my Fiat. And he comes back and he says, his eyes are this, he says, Niente olio. There's no oil in this car. There's none. And he shows me the thing. He says, the dipstick, there's no oil in here. He was so upset. He couldn't figure out how the car still drove. I had no indication the car needed oil. It ran like a champ. Guy was incredulous, and I was being very, I said, well, give it some oil. Just give the car whatever, how much oil it wants. I don't know. It's a Fiat. It's a happy Fiat. I loved that car. Oh my gosh, I love that car. And the car forgave me for not giving it oil, but I heard that it needed it. So when you take it up a notch, and it's not just a computer or it's just your refrigerator or it's just your car, it's part of your world. Give it good attention.
Thank you for saying that. And you're right, that I have so many questions on what you just said that would lead into another 2-hour podcast episode. But you touch on a lot of different concepts that I've heard people talk about before, where it's just kind of like people think objects don't have, I don't want to say feelings, that they're not alive. They can't pick up on certain frequencies, or they can't be influenced in certain ways, or feel if someone hates them or is treating them well. And you're kind of touching on that, and that's something I want to talk about at some point in the future. But thank you for breaking that down. So we can't finish this conversation without talking about the concept of protection, right? Because we've talked now on the previous podcast about black magic coming in contact with it. We've touched on that here too on this podcast. And some of the questions that the viewers have had is just kind of this whole idea of protection. Now, I've talked to different spiritual practitioners, and they always say, well, you don't really need protection if your vibration is super high. And sometimes when you're calling in protection, you're kind of inadvertently potentially lowering your vibration because you're giving into a fear frequency. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this concept of protection. Who needs it, and how often do we need it, especially if you're a spiritual practitioner?
I understand the argument that if you need protection, it deals with fear. Then why do you put your seatbelt on? I mean, why do you wear multi layers of clothes? Why don't you walk around in your underwear? Especially in, up here in the winter when it's, 12 degrees. You do it because you need layers and layers and layers that give you enormous strength. And a lot of people will say, oh, just bring down some white light. Um, you got to do more than that. And if you have ever been attacked spiritually, you do passive protection where you create layers of protection that are just in place. I lock my doors at night. I mean, when you're driving alone in a someplace, do you lock your car doors? I mean, when you go to bed at night, do you lock your front door? Does that mean you're fearful? No. It means that you're logical. If you don't lock your car doors and somebody steals from you, well, why weren't you protected? But remember, darkness always goes to the easiest target. That was, I was a terrorist expert for the submarine force. So, the first rule of terrorism is create a diversion. Funny, that's what 9/11 was. I mean, again, I can do an hour on protection and why you need it. Not because you're fearful, but because the stronger you are, layers of protection give you enormous strength and keep your frequency high. I mean, do you bathe every night? I mean, don't you want to wash off the residue of the day? It's a form of protection. If you add a little salt to when you're bathing, well, now you've washed off any negative auric residue. It's a level of protection. You enter the sleep state clean. Wash your feet. You've washed your foundation and renewed it. A lot of what qualifies as protection is also logic in how to conduct your life generally and especially with psychic ability. Doing spiritual practices is major protection, but it's also spiritual service. So is it a chicken or the egg? I kind of think it's both. So I I mean an enormous section, all of part 2 of this book, almost 200 pages, deals with protection. And what do you do about these things? And you have to build layer after layer after layer until it lives within you. Once it lives within you, you know how to project it so that you're such a hard target. You're going to cost the dark side way too much energy to mess with you. They'll pick a softer target. It's kind of the point of it. And believe me, bringing down a little white light now and then, not going to cut it. Not if you have real ability that you need to manage correctly.
Is it childish when people say, well, if you believe in black magic, then you could be affected by black magic. But if you don't believe in it, even if someone sends it your way, it's not going to affect you?
Well,
Or is there truth to that?
part of that concept is creating a reality. When I got smacked really hard with someone trying to really attack me, I had a computer company. I had a computer company. I was working with Apple Computer and Hewlett Packard and Kodak and doing trade shows. I mean, I could barely spell black magic. And so it kind of hit me, and I believe me, I wasn't thinking about it. I had no idea. I really thought I was going to have a computer company. I really thought that was what was going to happen. But my life took a different turn. And is was it a good or bad thing? It's how it worked out. I'm grateful for it because I really love what I do. And I guess what I would say is, let me ask anyone listening to this, is human trafficking real? If you decide it isn't real and you're not going to be affected by it, does it mean that it doesn't happen? Do you look out for your children when you're in a crowd? Or would you let your 5-year-old walk to school alone? Does that make you fearful or does it make you irresponsible? I think that we have to be very careful what that fine line is. And when you're looking at building what I would call layers of protection, I would offer that you build each layer really, really strongly with a good frame of mind, and not because you're fearful, but because it's like being correctly dressed to play in the snow for 8 hours in Wisconsin in January. You're not going to go outside in your underwear. To be able to handle the dimension of cold you're facing, you have to be realistic. I guess that's my best answer.
Thank you. And this is the last question regarding that. Is one of the listeners had asked, when you were first attacked with that black magic, when you had the software, the computer company, I should say, um, did you intuitively know that you needed to protect yourself? How did you figure out that you were being psychically attacked, and how did you know what to do to overcome that?
I had no idea what to do.
Mm.
I was clearly clueless. I mean, I don't know how to be any more honest than that. I had no idea what to do. I really thought I was going to keep designing software, which was a lot of fun. And I was so physically sick and so fogged, I couldn't think straight. I couldn't see straight. And I didn't know that someone could hand you a business card and your life could go to hell. And I didn't know this guy from Adam. I'd never met him before. Why me out of all the people at the convention center in San Diego? Why did you pick me? And I realized that if he hadn't picked me and I hadn't had to overcome that, it wouldn't have changed my life like it did. I had to follow a new path, and sometimes you have to have a bath of fire to do it. And I knew that something was connected to me, somebody really dark, and eventually and this happened in a space of 30 days. I've talked to people who've been at this 10 years. And I only had to go through it 30 days. I eventually got to the point I could see him. And all I can tell you is my terror was just mountainous. It's just mountainous. And so I didn't know what to do. And if my brother hadn't helped me, if he hadn't had he asked people that he knows, and they said do these things, and they were really entry level things. And then I started, once I, wasn't bed bound, I couldn't even get up. I couldn't drive a car, I couldn't cook. I couldn't be involved in my kids' activities. I was horrified. But once I got myself back together and realized what happened, new abilities started to awaken that I didn't know I was going to have. And I realized I had a new path. And so, was it a good thing or a bad thing? It was a learning experience that I chose. That's how I chose to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't afraid of black magic. I just I just didn't want to kiss a rattlesnake on the lips anymore.
Of course. So just to make sure I understand, so it's not like you knew exactly right away that you were affected by black magic. It seems that over time you intuitively realized that there was something connected to you, started to
Something
talk about
connected to
it,
me.
and then your
And
brother sought out
I,
help for you.
as I realized that by returning this guy's energy to him, because I had a right to defend myself. I mean, you could be walking down the street and out of nowhere somebody attacks you. You weren't thinking about being attacked. You were walking as a confident woman. How did that happen? Well, there's a lot of cosmic forces that occur that cause us to change how our lives are going to be. So, when I learned that I could stop the energy from coming at me, well, now that was a whole major piece of information to learn. And um, I needed to change my life. And then when a student is ready, a teacher starts to appear. And I had a couple of them. I didn't have many. But I did meet someone who said, you're not gonna, I don't think computers are gonna be your future. I think that this is really, probably what you're gonna be doing. Uh, and let's get all this, stuff out of the way. And then I remember he said, people are gonna find you. And I went, really? It's not like I'm gonna hang a hand outside my door. And within a year, I had one guy say, I was told in a dream to call you. The first time that happens, you think it, but by the 10th time it happens, okay, I must have a job here. Doesn't pay well, but I have a job.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So for everyone who's listening right now, and of course this episode is for educational purposes and us kind of digging into different topics and stuff like that. Obviously the audience, take from it what you will. But for those who are listening who might feel some sort of fear, right? Whether they're dabbling into tarot and then all of a sudden they're afraid that they might be dealing with not so good entities, or people who have are afraid of psychic attacks, who have psychic abilities. Any words to them so that they don't take fear from this conversation, but rather empowerment or the knowledge to know more?
If you have fear, do something about it. And if it's happening to you for a reason, so that you can grow from it and start doing your research. I mean, I wrote this book, which has a lot of this information and explains it. But in I think it's chapter 43, I have an entire section on additional reference material. So you're not just reading my stuff. There's some amazing authors out there, and I read these people. They're wonderful. So that you can get many views of how all this works. So that you can grow spiritually in many ways. I mean, I label all my water pipes and my ice maker with love and happiness to imbue that energy into those things. That's all protection. It raises frequency. Frequency is by definition, the higher the frequency, the more protected you are. When you get on this path of learning how this works, it is like mental popcorn. It's so much fun. And then you
Yeah.
stop worrying about protection and you start going, wow, is this fascinating?
Absolutely. And one thing I love about your book, and I can't wait to dig deep into it, just from looking at the what's the word where you
Content.
have, yes, just from looking at that and just seeing all of the different chapters, and you have so many case studies weaved into each chapter. I can't wait to sink my teeth into this book. I know it's going to be great. I know it's going to be filled with so much information. And I hope the listeners really, invest in and get the book as well. But before we even ask where people can find you and where they can purchase your book, have you shifted in perspective on anything recently that you'd like to share? And it could be lighthearted or as deep as you want it to be.
Have I shifted in perspective? I would say that we are entering a time of spiritual growth. People have choices now. And if they choose a spiritual path, it doesn't mean you're going to go stand on a street corner and say, doomsday's coming. Your spiritual path can be simply opening up to learning more things. Again, there's a lot of wonderful authors out there who are working very hard to share fascinating things. And I would not trade a minute of my journey, including the guy that tried to kill me. I can't believe how much I learned. So my perspective is that we're entering perhaps a higher spiritual time. And the more a person can move forward at their own pace, there's nobody going to, say, I'm watching you. Do it at your own pace. And begin in the simplest way by building a relationship with God. I mean, it's about the easiest way to begin your spiritual path. And when you're always connected to the divine, there's a light that goes on inside of you. And wink, wink, that light goes on inside every cell in your body. Oh my gosh, when every cell in your body is filled with light, guess what's not there? The darkness of illness or depression or disease. So you have all of these synergistic side effects from embarking on a spiritual path.
I love that. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you, connect with you, and purchase your book?
Ghosthelpers.com. It's Ghost Helpers with an S. And the books are listed on the website under books. They're also on Amazon, and um, they're audiobooks as well. Some I just talked to ACX today to marry the Audible books and the formats on Amazon. So you can go to Audible and you can find Psychic Children, Psychic People, and the Crossing Over Prayer Book, and most of the other ones. So, and give yourself some time, study. Don't just, you can listen to your higher self. Remember, your subconscious is the gatekeeper to higher self. When you and your subconscious embark on connecting to the higher realms through prayer, sending prayer to the world without prejudice or judgment, it elevates your frequency automatically. And you will change in the most beautiful, subtle ways. And if you pray with a child, you open that door for a child in ways you might never have imagined.
Mm, I love that. Thank you so much, Tina, for stopping by Shifting Dimensions again. I have a feeling that you're gonna be on the show many more times. So thank you so much for imparting so much wisdom to my listeners and just sharing your time, energy, and presence with all of us. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.